Family and friends, welcome to my next video, and welcome to northern Maine, more specifically Perrin, Maine, on this cold, rainy June day. I'm here at what I consider to be one of the most peaceful places on earth, and that would be the Fairview Cemetery here in Perrin, Maine. So we'll start the video in Plymouth, Massachusetts. We will end it back here when we try to find the graves of my grandparents and great-grandparents. But first, 9th great-grandfather in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Enjoy the video. We'll see you back here at the end. Welcome, family and friends, to my next road trip adventure. I find myself this morning in the beautiful historic town of Plymouth, Massachusetts. And on this trip, I will So on this road trip through my Mayflower roots, I've landed now at one of the most important moments is when my 9th great-grandfather, George Soule, he helped sign the Mayflower Compact. In 1620, after 66 days crammed on a ship, no personal space, probably very questionable smells, the Pilgrims realized that maybe we need some ground rules before we go ashore. George was only 21 years old. Technically, he was a servant, but still, he was one of the 41 men who signed what became one of the first frameworks for self-government in America. Pretty cool for a guy who probably hadn't bathed since he left England. The eventual governor, William Bradford, would document all of the passengers on the Mayflower, and here we find Mr. Edward Winslow, Elizabeth his wife, and 2 men servants called George Soule and Elias Story. Also a little girl was put to him called Ellen, the sister of Richard Moore. So while most of the Pilgrims came to the New World seeking religious freedom, new opportunities, unfortunately the story of Ellen Moore was much more tragic. When Father Samuel Moore, so he thought, of England, started to realize that none of his 4 children seemed to resemble him, he started to suspect they were not his. Eventually, wife Catherine admitted she had been unfaithful to Samuel, and the children were actually fathered by Jacob Blakeway, a tenant farmer on their property. Samuel, as the children's legal father, could do with the children as he pleased. He certainly did not want another man's children, and he wanted to punish his wife. He learned of the future voyage of the Pilgrims, and he found his solution: to place the children with influential families as servants. Unfortunately, only one of the 4 Moore children would survive the first winter in Plymouth. Also, servant Elias Story and wife Elizabeth would die that first winter of 1620. Only Edward Winslow and my grandfather George Soule would survive. Chances are, my grandfather George Soule got himself a seat at the very first Thanksgiving in the fall of 1621, probably grateful just to be alive after that very brutal first year, but it wasn't George who wrote home about it. That job fell to his boss, Edward Winslow. He sent off a letter describing the whole feast with the native people. Little did he know that letter would inspire centuries of tradition, like stuffing ourselves silly and watching grown men tackle each other over a football. 400 years ago, 3 years after the Mayflower, a young woman stepped onto a ship called the Anne with no other family at the age of 18, and nobody knows why. Was she after adventure, or was she possibly escaping something? Her name was Mary Beckett, my 9th great-grandmother. On this day, I stepped way back in time into the 1620s, right into the Pilgrims neighborhood here at Plymouth Plantation. And yes, I found my 9th great-grandfather George Soule's house, a reproduction of course. Had everything that a young pilgrim might need, a thatched roof, no plumbing. George lived here with his wife Mary and had a lot of kids. Have no idea how they all fit in there. Life was rough, but they made it work. Just imagine waking up at sunrise, feeding the chickens, chopping wood, trying not to freeze, and still having time to start a new democracy.
It was the only thing I could suppose.
Would any of you gentlemen know anything about my 9th great-grandfather, George Soule? Did he live here?
He is not a grandfather. For George Soule, I do know, for he is a former servant of Master Winslow here. For Goodman George Soule, he lives at the bottom of the hill.
Okay, I've not seen him about this day, but yay.
He does live here.
For he has of his first child, Zachariah, as of now, and for him and his wife Mary, they live at the bottom of the hill. But he did arrive as a servant to Master Winslow.
In 1627, my 9th great-grandfather George Soule and a few other of his pilgrim friends migrated one town north, or I should say migrated north and started a new town here called Duxbury, Massachusetts, a small, quaint town today. I'm currently on a little island called Soule's Island, and I have to say I'm a little disappointed in Grampy Soule that he didn't pass this island down to his 10th great-grandson, because I would be a very wealthy person right now. I'm here in Duxbury, Massachusetts at the oldest maintained cemetery in the United States. And this is where the remains of my 9th great-grandfather George Soule is buried. A bit of a rainy day here in Duxbury, but I suppose that if the pilgrims were able to withstand 2 months crossing the brutal Atlantic Ocean on the Mayflower, I can probably handle some raindrops here today. Nearby rests George Soule, pilgrim, a signer of the Mayflower Compact on November the 11th, 1620, who died in January of 1680. George and Mary Soule would have a total of 9 children, the 5th of which was my 8th great-grandmother, Susannah. But before we talk about her, let's look at some court records to learn a little bit more about Susannah's brothers and sisters. As it turns out, some of Susannah's siblings were a bit colorful in their personality. For example, on March 3rd, 1662, the court fined Elizabeth and a man by the name of Nathaniel Church for committing fornication. Elizabeth then in turn sued Nathaniel Church for committing an act of fornication with her and then denying to marry her. The jury awarded her damages plus court costs. And then in July of 1667, Elizabeth was sentenced to be whipped at the post for committing fornication a second time. And although the man with whom she committed the act was not named, Elizabeth did marry Francis Walker within the following year. And then on March 1st, 1674, brother Nathaniel was sentenced to be whipped for lying with an Indian woman, not lying to an Indian woman, and had to pay a fine in the form of bushels of corn to the Indian woman towards the keeping of the child. So a little bit of spice within the Soule family. Let's see what grandfather George Soule left my grandmother Susannah in his will. To my sons Nathaniel and George, all of my lands in Dartmouth. To my daughters Elizabeth and Patience, all of my lands in Middlebury. to my eldest son John, who has cared for me in my old age, all of the rest of my lands, my home, my goods, and name him my sole executor. And then finally to my daughters Susannah and Mary, 12 pence apiece. Maybe enough to buy a loaf of bread. Was it because she'd already gotten her share earlier, or was Dad trying to make a statement to Susannah? These are mysteries that we'll never know the answers to. At some point in time, my 8th great-grandmother Susannah found her way to North Kingstown, Rhode Island, where she married a man by the name of Francis West. From there, the trail goes cold. There's no record of where they were buried. There's no gravestones, just silence. So I went looking for answers. The North Kingstown Public Library seemed like the perfect place to start. A helpful librarian led me to an old, heavy book. Its pages were filled with burial locations of the town's earliest residents. I turned the pages, hoping to find Susannah's name. Nothing. But then something else caught my eye. The Boone family. A name I knew would appear in my story, but not for another couple generations. And there it was, a hand-drawn map leading to a hidden burial site deep in the woods for my 6th great-grandmother, Mary Boone, who was the wife of Samuel Boone. At that moment, my quiet afternoon in the library turned into an adventure, and there was no question that I had to find it. Eighth great-grandmother Susannah and her husband Francis West have a total of 9 children. Child number 6 is my 7th great-grandmother, Martha West. I am currently in a little town called Exeter, Rhode Island. Population is about 6,000. And this cemetery, the Chestnut Hill Cemetery here in Exeter, is the resting place for my 7th great-grandparents, Martha Fones and Jeremiah Fones. Now this cemetery, in addition to being the resting place for my 7th great-grandparents, also has some real interesting stories associated with it, and I will tell you about that after we find my grandparents' tombstones, which in itself has an interesting story associated with it. So let's look around here and see if we can find Grandma and Grandpa Fones here in Exeter, Rhode Island. So as it turns out, my 7th great grandparents, they actually died many years before this cemetery even existed. So you ask, why are they buried here then? They were originally buried next to their home in North Kingston, Rhode Island, a few miles down the road. They actually removed the remains from that cemetery and they moved them here to this beautiful cemetery here in Exeter. A very unusual story here at the Chestnut Hill Cemetery in Exeter, Rhode Island. The Brown family, which I believe are buried over there. When I came to visit the graves of my 7th great-grandparents here in Exeter, Rhode Island, I expected to find history, maybe some moss-covered stones, hopefully not too many mosquitoes, but what I did not expect was vampires. Just down the pathway from my grandparents lies Mercy Brown, the young woman at the center of one of the strangest episodes in New England folklore. Back in 1892, the Brown family had a run of tragic deaths from tuberculosis. But this was before people really understood germs, so instead of blaming bacteria, they blamed vampires. Yes, the town believed that Mercy, who had already passed away, was rising from the grave at night and draining the life from her surviving relatives. So they removed her body from this very crypt in the middle of a brutal Rhode Island winter, found her body to be unusually well preserved, and declared, yep, she's definitely a vampire. So what was the cure? They removed her heart, they burned it, and made her ailing brother Edwin drink the ashes. Apparently a new kind of home remedy of sorts. Spoiler alert, he died anyways. So here I am visiting my ancestors and realizing that their cemetery neighbor may be the most famous vampire in American history. History can be strange, but it is intriguing when it happens so close to the history of your very own ancestors. My 7th great-grandfather, Jeremiah Fones, had 8 children with his first wife, and then 5 children with Martha West, my 7th great-grandmother, including my 6th great-grandmother, Mary Fones. But before I search out my 6th great-grandmother, Mary, I must tell you the story about my 6th great-uncle, Captain Daniel Fones. He was a rather famous man here in coastal Rhode Island history. Before there was even a United States of America, 6th great-uncle Daniel Fones was a privateer. He was basically a pirate with a license from the British Crown. While not officially part of the British military, he was a hero for multiple missions against the French in the mid-1700s, including saving nearly 500 colonial troops and turning the tide of the battle for Louisburg. After Uncle Daniel retired from his duties as a privateer, he returned home to Rhode Island, where he traded the roar of cannons for telling of his stories in the Daniel Fones Tavern that he started right here at 126 Main Street in beautiful Wickford, Rhode Island. I can only imagine that the stories of his sea adventures must have flowed as freely as the ale did there in the Daniel Fones Tavern. Captain Daniel Fones, or Uncle Daniel, as I call him. Quite a legend in this little town, apparently. Hope you can hear me. It's a very windy day here in Providence, Rhode Island. And now we are searching for my 6th great-grandmother. And her name would be Mary Fones, who married Ebenezer Hill, Captain Ebenezer Hill. Now, unfortunately, they both died in their 40s. They did have 7 or 8 children. one of which was daughter Ruth Hill, and she would be great-grandmother number 5. But first we must search for 6th great-grandmother Mary Hill. Let's see if I can find her here. Here lies my 6th great-grandmother, Mary Hill, laid to rest in Providence, Rhode Island. She died in her early 40s, a mother, a wife, a woman whose life was far too short. Her husband, my 6th great-grandfather, Captain Ebenezer Hill, he likely died at sea in 1753, also in his early 40s. He was buried far from home in the Caribbean Netherlands. They that trust in the Lord be as Mount Zion, which cannot be removed, but abideth forever. Because both of my 6 great-grandparents here died in their 40s with 8 children, I couldn't stop wondering what might have happened to these children since their parents died at such a young age. Ebenezer was 2 years old, Martha was 5 years old. What happened to these children back in the 1750s? Well, I found a document that helped me answer that question. If you remember, my great-uncle and local hero Captain Daniel Fones was the brother of Mary Fones, and he retired from his successful privateering duties back in the 1750s. In this legal document from 1758, we see the words Captain Daniel Fones, guardianship. I dig deeper into the document and I find this wording. Mary Hill, daughter of Ebenezer Hill of Providence, deceased, hath made choice of the said Daniel Fones to be guardian to her person and estate, and also that the said town council have appointed in aforesaid Daniel Fones to the guardian to the person and estate of Martha Hill, an infant daughter of the aforementioned Ebenezer Hill, which several truths the said Daniel Fones both accept of. It's powerful to uncover a historic record that proves these children were protected, and even more striking that their guardian was Captain Daniel Fones himself. Just one more example of how this journey of mine keeps uncovering unexpected stories of family, duty, and legacy. Of these 8 children, Ruth was my 5th great-grandmother. She lost her parents at an early age, and just when it seemed like life might finally settle down, an even greater upheaval was waiting for her. It was 1761 when my family would get mixed up with the Boone family, a respected farming family in the Providence, Rhode Island area, owning some 600 acres of land there. 5th great-grandmother Ruth Hill would marry William Boone, son of Samuel and Mary Boone, who we found her burial location earlier. By 1775, William and Ruth would already have 5 of their eventual 10 children. The Boone family were loyalists, staying loyal to the British Crown and not desiring independence. They were on the losing side of this war, and for this decision they paid the price by losing all of their land, all of their possessions. William's father Samuel would be sent to a loyalist prison in Pennsylvania, where he would die at the age of 65. William and Ruth would also lose everything at the end of the war, around 1783, and they would be forced to leave with their 6 young children to British-owned territory. When the Boones arrived in New Brunswick on the loyalist ship called the Union, there was nothing waiting for them there. They were given some undeveloped land, had to start basically from nothing, much like when my 9th great-grandfather George Soule arrived on the Mayflower in Plymouth. Here's a quote from a loyalist on one of those voyages to New Brunswick. "We pitched our tents in the shelter of the woods. We tried to cover them with spruce boughs. We used stones for fireplaces. Our tents had no floors but the ground. How we lived through that winter, I barely know." What I'm about to show you is not just a record in a dusty archive, it's the voice of my 5th great-grandfather William Boone, written nearly 250 years ago, describing the price he paid for remaining loyal to the crown during the Revolution and asking for help from the British government. Here's what it says. "That your memorialist was possessed of considerable property in Kings County on Rhode Island until the commencement of the late dissensions in America, at which time he was called on to aid against his Majesty's enemies in America, and on his refusal was insulted, abused, and imprisoned, his effects and property taken and sold to the ruin of himself and family, and he obliged to flee to his Majesty's troops for protection. He was taken a prisoner and continued as such for nearly 20 months. So William Boone and Ruth Hill Boone would be my 5th great-grandparents, and they are buried somewhere in this cemetery. And we had to make quite a little trip from Providence, Rhode Island to get to this cemetery, because after the Revolutionary War, William Boone and his wife Ruth moved their family out of the colonies and here into New Brunswick, Canada. So we are currently in Burt's Corner, a very small town where William Boone was one of the first settlers here in Burt's Corner in New Brunswick. And at the end of the Revolutionary War, because the Boone family was loyal to the British Crown, they left. They were forced to leave Rhode Island, otherwise face imprisonment. So William Boone picked up his family. One of the kids was William II, who we will be searching up after this. But first we need to try to find the grave of my 5th great-grandparents, William and Ruth Boone. William Boone died in 1829 at 85 years old, and Ruth died in 1833 at 89 years of age. As we have borne the image of the earthly, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly. On this night, after visiting William and Ruth Boone's resting place in Burt's Corner, I find a friendly little farm that hosts RVers called the Dancing Goat Therapy Farm right on the Keswick River. Beautiful little place, very cute animals. That evening, as I get on my computer looking for some history of the region, I found an old land grant map from way back in the early 1800s when the Loyalists were settling in the area. I overlaid that map with a more modern map of where I'm camping for the night, and then my jaw kind of drops when I realize that I'm sitting on land that was previously owned by the Boone family. Miracles happen every day. This was a pretty cool one. Ruth and William would have 10 children, and their second child was William II. So now I'm somewhere else in New Brunswick, and what an honor and a privilege to have made it to the Boone Cemetery. This would be the resting place of my fourth great-grandfather, William Boone II. He was born in 1766, died in 1849. Can't tell exactly where the stone is. I am confident that this is the resting place, but over the years, the stones have been broken, or they're just lying down and been covered by several inches of dirt and grass. Most likely William II and his wife Anne Hayward are buried right here, and I cannot imagine a more peaceful resting place than this. I'm almost certain that it does say William II, so in memory of William II. It's hard to make out the words beneath it, but could very well be the resting place for fourth great-grandfather, and I'm sure his wife is close by. The stone used to be mounted on this stone here, but many years ago it fell down, and that's where it will stay. Very, very happy that I came here. Ultimate peaceful spot right here at the Boone Cemetery in New Brunswick. Fourth great-grandparents William Boone II and his wife Anne would have 12 children, the second of which was Anne, my third great-grandmother. My third great-grandmother, Anne Boone, would marry Asa Carr in 1814 at 24 years of age. He was 19 years old and a farmer in the Gary, New Brunswick area. Anne would live 23 days past her 100th birthday, dying in March of 1890. Her obituary would read that to this union there were born 11 children, 58 grandchildren, 103 great-grandchildren, and 2 great-great-grandchildren. She professed religion for over 50 years. She was a loyal Baptist and died full of years and good works. In his will, Asa would leave all of his land to his first child, Eben, except for a small parcel of land to be used for this cemetery. We have driven about 2 kilometers down the street here in New Brunswick. I'm not expecting too many problems here to find Asa Carr and Anne Carr's grave, since we happen to be in the Asa Carr cemetery. Asa Carr, his wife Anne Boone, descendant of William Carr, who was also a United Empire loyalist, erected by the descendants of Asa Carr in 1988. Asa and Anne would have 9 children. We can see from the gravestone that 2 of the children died during childbirth. The last child of Asa was born when Anne was around 47 years old. 7th child, Franklin Carr, my second great-grandfather, was born in 1829. Not surprisingly, it appears there was a lot of interaction between the Boones and the Carrs. When I see that practically every generation from my Mayflower grandfather, George Soule, all the way to my great-great-grandfather here, Franklin Carr, it seems like everybody's having 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 children. So it's not hard to see how somebody like George Soule can have hundreds of thousands of descendants still alive today. When you do the math, and everybody has 12 children, 10 children, and those all have 10 children, that starts multiplying quite quickly. My great-great-grandfather, Franklin Carr, would marry Elizabeth Smith, and yes, they were first cousins. Back then, it wasn't all that unusual. Today, though, it might raise a few eyebrows. This is great-great-grandfather Franklin Carr's tombstone, born in 1829 and passed away in 1915. So, another good long life. Franklin married Elizabeth, his wife, who passed away in 1911. First cousins and my great-great-grandparents, Frank and Elizabeth Carr, would have a total of 8 children. Child number 7 was my great-grandmother, Zella Carr. So welcome back to Perham, Maine. We have made our way all the way from Plymouth, Massachusetts, back here to Perham, Maine. And we're going to end this video as I walk towards my great grandparents on my father's mother's side. So I successfully found my great-great-grandparents here, John Holts and his wife Rhoda. But I'm having a real struggle finding my great-grandparents, George Holts and Zella Holts. And I know they're in this area. Okay, I did finally find great-grandparents here. George Holts, Zella Holts. Great-grandfather, born in 1871, passed away in 1939. great-grandmother Zella Holts, originally Zella Carr, who we found her parents in New Brunswick, and somehow she met up with my grandfather George here in Perham. I believe George spent his entire life in Perham, Maine. Zella was born in 1870 and passed away in 1962. So good long life for grandmother Zella Holts. My great-grandparents George and Zella Holts would have 5 children. Child number 2 was my grandmother Adina. My grandmother, Adina Holts, was just 18 years old when she married Carl Victor Helstrom, aged 25, on June 21st, 1927. Their life together began in the very home built by my great-grandfather Victor Helstrom, a Swedish immigrant who would raise 9 children here, in a house that would become a center of so many of my childhood memories. A 1930 census in Perham paints the picture. 3 years into their marriage, my grandfather Carl was the only of Victor's 9 children living in the home, along with his parents Victor and Hattie, along with his wife Adina, and their 1-year-old son, my uncle Dale. By the time of the 1940 census, the family had grown. Carl and Adina now filled that home with 4 children, including their youngest at the time, a 1-year-old baby boy who would become my father, Carl Terry. I'll always treasure those years surrounded by family, the laughter of my aunts Betty and Wanda, the stories from Uncle Dale, and the warmth of my grandparents' home still echo in my heart today. In 1959, my father Carl married Priscilla Anderson, and together they raised 3 children, Debbie, Diana, and the best-looking of the 3, Terry. And with that, we've traveled across 12 generations from the voyage of the Mayflower in 1620 to present-day 2025. What an incredible journey it has been. I consider myself deeply fortunate that the winding path of my ancestry led here to northern Maine, where family, heritage, and memory intertwine in such a powerful way.